like your story on education and where we're at in the state. You hit a lot of it, so I'll try and elaborate a little bit more on that. First off, thank you all for being here. Thank you for the work that you do within our community to make it strong. You're the ones who are not just posting on Facebook, as easy as that is, but I know that you're the ones who get out when campaigns come, to go knock on doors, to make phone calls, to make a difference, to nudge your friends to get out to the polls, even when there's elections where sometimes you might not even know everybody who's on the ballot, but you know that it's important to vote, and you know which races are the most important to get out for. So thank you for your avid participation in our democracy and in your community. I really appreciate that. Just to give you a little bit more of my background on how I got to be the youngest state senator and the youngest leader we've had since before World War II. And somebody pointed out the youngest state leader in the country currently. And that is, it started when I started to get engaged in politics from the outside. And I didn't get interested into politics until about 2004, and that was with that presidential campaign, where I decided I was going to get really active, and I decided to get a button on my backpack. I still carry on the backpack. And I was going to put a bumper sticker on the back of my car, and I even gave, I think it was $20 to John Kerry. And that was it. And I was like, okay, fully engaged. I've done everything I can to make a difference, you know. And then I watched with eagerness on election night, like, okay, we did everything. Let's see, here we go. And then it ended up turning out the way that it did. And I remember being completely devastated, thinking, well, what the heck? How could that have happened? Didn't they see my clever bumper sticker? I was driving around in my Chevy Prism, but no, I didn't do it. And so I decided I'm going to get more engaged. I'm going to figure out what else I can do. And so from there I went back to college. I got involved with College Dems, where I met Sam Libert, where we became friends. Ran for a position in College Dems, became second vice chair, which doesn't sound like much, but the most important position, besides chair and vice chair and all the other ones really. But I had an elected position, so that was the first election that I won. Was involved with College Dems, got an internship in college with an environmental group, got more active after that with the party, and got involved with the Democratic Leadership Institute, which DLI, and there's one coming up, kind of targets young people. So some people who might have been a part of that, I learned a lot there. Got involved with ADLI, which is a little bit more advanced, and continued to pretty much ask the question, what else can I do, what else can I do? Ended up meeting Robert F. Kennedy Jr. and had the privilege of talking to him and asking him about environmental issues, which is things I really cared about. And asked him, what else can I be doing? I feel like I'm doing all of this, getting involved in campaigns, getting clipboards out there, to have petitions signed, to get out there when there's a campaign nudging people to go vote. But I don't feel like it's making a big difference. What else can I be doing? He said you got to think about running for office. And this was just 2006. And then I said, oh yeah, years from now, maybe when I'm older, when I'm retired, I have nothing better to do. That's who really cares about politics, right? People who are retired and people who are rich and can afford to run for office. And he said, no, you have to run now when a seat opens up, because if you don't run, somebody else does. They might not believe what you believe. They might not think the way that you think, and then that's not going to have an impact if you're trying to write them, if you're trying to call them, if you're trying to make that difference. Because they've already made up their mind. If you don't run, you already lose, and they already win. And that person moves on to run for something else, and we're that much further behind. And that really stuck with me. Got a job at the party, ended up running for office the next year for an open county board seat. So if you're keeping track, this is just 3 years in or 2 years in. It was 2008 that I ran and won for a county board seat. It's exactly 5 years ago. I was reminded of it as I sat across from the governor today. That it was 5 years, and I've always been opposite the governor, or opposite Scott Walker. When I was a county board supervisor, he was a county executive. So I like to joke that I'm like the ex-girlfriend showing up on his wedding day. And I'm like, don't trust this guy. Here's what he's really all about. And I said just as much. So I fast forward, I ended up running for state senate, and I think it's important to mention that I ran against a Democrat. I'm a Democrat. I don't assume you all are Democrats, but it was a hard label for me to come to because I didn't feel like Democrats were doing everything I wanted them to do. I thought they could take harder stances on some issues. And the Democrat who was representing me in the state senate was a guy named Jeff Claley. And I was frustrated with some of his stances, particularly on the environment, particularly on women's right to choose, and in particular on education. And so I decided I was going to run against him. My party, Democratic Party that I decided to embrace, had said, you shouldn't do this. They threatened to push me out and I'd never be able to run for anything. But we had a good coalition of people, and over a 3-month campaign, which those of you that know campaigns know that that's pretty quick, we ended up challenging the establishment. We ended up unseating somebody who had been in state office for 14 years, and we won with 61% of the vote. But in that time, I was also running against my party. I was also running against a lot of the members who I would be serving with. And so over the last 2 years and a few months, I've been working to earn their support and earn their trust and to embrace what their priorities are. And so that's why I feel it's a big validation to be able to have their support and to be elected leader by them, by my caucus, a group that I ran against. And I think the reason is because they know I've got energy. They know that I share their priorities and put them front and center, as I put my constituents front and center, as I put my people I serve front and center. And was able to get their support to be the leader, to try and get us to the majority, which is a direction I think we're heading in over the next couple of years based off of how the Republicans are beating themselves up right now, and the way they're going really far on the extreme. So that's how I got here. That's how I got where I am. And it's suiting. Is this mine, Shannon? Yep. Thank you. And there's I saw you guys had smoothies in the back, and so I had to try them, so you have to forgive me. That's good. So today we actually launched a petition. So how many are you on Facebook? If you're on Twitter, you may have seen it. If you didn't, you should go there after the meeting. You can go and you can sign it and share it. It's a petition that says we want to make sure that education is a priority for the state of Wisconsin again. And we want to make sure that vouchers continue to stop being expanded on until they are accountable. And it's a petition. We've launched it this morning. I don't know how many people we've got to sign on it so far, but we had over 50 last time I checked.
There's a couple hundred.
A couple hundred. So it's picking up some steam, picking up some momentum. I think it's important because education is an issue that should be important for everybody in the state of Wisconsin. I don't know about you, but I think Wisconsin is an education state. You know, we've always prided ourselves on having a strong tradition of education. Kindergarten, the idea of kindergarten was the first one here in the state of Wisconsin. We've had that strong tradition of education for such a long time, and with the University of Wisconsin, not just the Madison School, but the entire system priding itself on higher education. We've seen that change, unfortunately, over the last 2.5 years. Chuck kind of touched on that. We saw the largest cut. Unfortunately, we were making history in the advances we were making, but for the last 2.5 years, we've made history for the wrong reasons. We saw an attack on our public school teachers in the form of Act 10, a group who I was always taught to treat as heroes in our society, as people who were not rewarded for the work that they really put in. My mom's a teacher. And the amount of work that you put in to be a teacher it's more than a 9 to 5. You know, it's more than the hours that you're there. It's an investment in each of those students. And to see the governor pick a fight with the public school teachers, and it wasn't a fight of necessity, it was a fight of want, that he thought that this was the fight that he was going to pick. He was going to pick his enemy, and that was teachers. And I think the response that we got from the country when I and the other 13 left, and it was Mark Pocan who was in the assembly, we met. Mark Pocan and the other 37 assemblymen, assembly representatives, they fought that bill. And I think it was, a large piece of that was what happened with education and the cuts that had happened to it and going after those teachers. And if that wasn't enough, you're familiar with the rest of the fight. If that wasn't enough, we then saw the largest cut in our state's history to K-12 education. I mean, just take that in for a second. $1.6 billion cut from our schools, which is a huge number. It's more than any other time in our state history that amount has been cut. And that's where our schools were. And a lot of them said, okay, we can make that. So it basically forced these schools to cut their teachers, to cut their pay, to cut their benefits under what an act had opened up for them. From there, they even in our school, we have some conservative school districts that said we can make this work. We'll be fine with that, as much as they didn't want to admit that they were struggling. But then what happened with this budget, where we are today, is we saw a freeze, which sounds good to some people actually, because it says, well, at least we're not going further down. But this is basically a continuation of the largest cut in education history. It sticks to that low point, where if I had a chart, sometimes we bring them to town halls, it shows where the state has been at in inflation-adjusted costs and as far as where we are in per pupil spending. And it's been pretty even. It hasn't been going up. It's not, the stories sometimes you hear in the news where education is getting all of this extra money. It's been pretty level, just keeping up with inflation for years. But there's a huge cut that happened 2 years ago, and that's the level it's staying at. So a remarkable thing happened. A lot of these schools are starting to speak up and say that they cannot sustain a 0% increase. To be clear, they ended up saying that there was going to be a few extra $1 million. You may have heard that. There's a few extra $1 million that were going in. But the important part to remember is that it actually doesn't go directly to the classrooms because, I don't know how wonky you guys are, but it doesn't allow for additional funds to be spent within an entire school district, because that was frozen in the last budget. So it's still frozen. So when money comes in, the only thing that it can be used for is for property tax reduction. You can't spend another dollar on in that classroom that you didn't spend before. So all it does is go to reduce property taxes. So it's not even an increase in funding, which is rather insulting to even say that there is an increase. And then, of course, at the same time as this is happening with our traditional public schools, we see the voucher expansion. Now, how many of you are relatively familiar with the voucher program? Yes, are very smart. Good, good. Well, we've been very familiar with it in Milwaukee, where I live and where I have lived for my whole life, where it existed since 1990. And suddenly we're going to see this huge expansion of it. And this is a program, mind you, that over those 23 years that it's existed, they have not gotten around to making sure that it abides by the same standards as our traditional public schools, that they can still report what they can report what they want. Imagine that. Imagine if you were a student and you could report the grades that you wanted, or you took a test and you just cut out the pieces you didn't want to get graded. But that's where they're at after 23 years. And they still get priority funding, which means that as long as they have a button seat where they have a pupil there, they're going to get paid for it, regardless of whether they keep that student there the day after that. So they get priority funding, and they don't have to adjust it. Whereas traditional public schools, they have to. The public school board has to adjust the overall budget based off what they get. They have to go to the levy. They have to make those hard decisions. The voucher schools automatically get that money, that strict dollar amount, no matter what. In addition to that, they don't have to take the hardest to teach students. Now, some of them do. And I had this argument today with Archbishop, but some of them don't. And that's the downside of it, and that's where they end up having a clear advantage. Where if there's a hard to teach student, they don't have to take them, or they can just kick them out. Or there's somebody who has a disability. They don't have to take them. And if they do take them, they don't have to make special accommodations for them by making sure that there's a qualified teacher to handle them. And that's where they end up having this advantage. So you may end up seeing, this is what study after study is showing, that you don't get better test results either. You don't get better results out of these systems. You don't get, what better test results, you don't get better graduation rates. What you do get is it costs a little bit less. And so that's become the default position. All it costs us less. Well, you can pick and choose who you want, you pay less, right? It'd be like if I decided to pick up a game of basketball here in the room, and I said, okay, I'm going to be a captain, and Chuck will be a captain, but I'm going to choose all the players I want, and you're going to get stuck with whoever's left. And if I don't like any of my players while I'm playing, you get them too. Now who's going to win that game, right? Probably Chuck, because I don't know who's good at basketball. Might be Chuck. But probably the one who gets priority, and that's exactly right. That's what ended up happening. So it's an unfair system. And I think most of us, whether we know the details of how voucher systems work, I think most of us in our society, not just Rock County progressives, but most people want a sense of fairness. And that's why you're seeing this result where even Waukesha County and other conservative parts of the state are coming out against this because they know it's not fair where this program is expanding. So if you didn't know, the budget that Walker proposed, while it froze our traditional public school spending at the previous historic cut level, voucher schools get an expansion. Not just within the system in Milwaukee, in Racine where it exists, but to 9 new parts of the state. And I think it's pretty amazing and telling how he did this. It was a strange rollout where on a Sunday he pointed out these 9 school districts that were failing. And he said, guess what, your school district is failing. And all these 9 districts, one of them, I think the closest one to us is Beloit, that's part of that. Yeah, surprise, suddenly, did you know your school district's failing? Is it a surprise to them too?
Well, I suspicion that.
Yeah, and so all of a sudden, Beloit found out, Waukesha found out, places across the state, Sheboygan found out, Appleton found out, Kenosha. All of a sudden, on Sunday, the governor says, you have a failing school district. What are you talking about? And then 2 days later, he said, guess what, here's how we're going to fix it. Vouchers. And they didn't know this. They didn't know that all of a sudden there's going to be an expansion in their backyard. And so these school districts have come out, one after the other, coming out against it because it doesn't make sense. One of the surefire things that you get, so those of you that don't know, haven't lived in Milwaukee, the guaranteed thing you get from having a voucher expansion is you're going to have higher property taxes. That's a sure thing. Because suddenly you're not just paying for one school system anymore, you're paying for 2. You're paying for one that gets priority no matter what, and then the traditional public school system. So that's a guarantee. And the other guarantee is that you're going to see less funds in the traditional school system because it's going to end up tilting that way. You're going to get less funds from the state coming in to help your school system, which I won't bore you with how the formula works, but basically the students aren't fully counted when they're in the voucher system, so they don't get the full aid from the state. So that's a guarantee. So a lot of these school districts, they know that, which is why they're coming out against it, which is why they're speaking out against it, and which is why it's important that people know the downfalls of what voucher expansion means. If that wasn't enough, there's more. You have something in there because I told you how they didn't have to take students with special needs. They have something in there called the special needs voucher, which sounds like, okay, fine, they're finally going to take them, but if you think about it, it's a blatant admission that they weren't accepting these special needs students before, because finally they're saying, okay, we'll take them, we're going to need some more money on top of that. So they get more, I think it's about $13,000 that comes from the state that comes if they take these special needs voucher students, which, okay, finally, maybe they're doing something with it. But wait, there's more. It's not clearly defined what it means to be a special needs student. And when this bill came up 2 years ago, we were worried that it could just mean as something as small as that student was a little bit behind in their literacy. Let's say they're behind 2 grades. Maybe they're a first grader, or they're a third grader reading at first grade level. And that could end up being a qualification because it hasn't been clearly defined. What could end up happening too with this is once in, always in. So even if that student has that lag, even if they catch up, they could end up being funded at that higher level through the rest of grade school and through high school. Yeah, and so it's not the matter of the student you might be picturing, you know, a student who, you know, is wheelchair bound, or a student who is blind, or a student who has English as a second language, or who has a speaking disorder. Those could be taken, but more likely than not, given the nature of how vouchers have functioned in the past, they can still end up taking those easier to teach students and leaving the rest out there. So again, imagining the basketball scenario, it's still, they get to choose, they get first priority of who they want to choose. Public schools are left with the rest. And that's why property taxes end up going up. And that's why you end up having a system where it gets so separate. On top of that, these students, these new schools, they don't end up having to have, they still don't have to have special accommodations for those special needs students. So they don't have to do anything special. They could, they don't have to. And the scariest part about it is that the parents, once they sign in to go to a private school, they sign away a lot of their rights to be able to hold that school accountable in case something bad happens. You have to sign that away. And so that's why there's a group called the Stop Special Needs Vouchers Now that has quite a few members. Are on Facebook. They've been speaking publicly, and they have a public hearing tomorrow on this very topic. So it's another piece that's hidden in this budget on education.